Welcome, everyone, to today's webcast, Ransomware Resilience in 2022. Don't go it alone. That's the whole point of today's webcast. I'm your host, Microsoft MVP, Nick Cavalancia. A couple of housekeeping notes before we do get started here. Today's webcast is being recorded. You'll, of course, as with most webcasts, get a link to the recording afterwards via email in a day or so. So be on the lookout for that in case you want to share it with colleagues. Maybe you have to jump out early from today's webcast, et cetera, et cetera. We also do have the Q&A box open here today. If you do have questions anytime during the webcast, we have a panel of experts today to have a discussion around this idea of ransomware resilience. And if you want to put a question, a comment, an anecdote, whatever it is you feel like sharing in that box, we'll try to make sure we incorporate those throughout the webcast if we can. We'll certainly have some Q&A time at the very end as well. So let me introduce our speakers. We've got a panel of speakers there. I think I just jumped a slide. There we go. A panel of industry experts here all around the area of data protection. Joining me today, I'm just going to kind of introduce each one of you. Would love for you to say hello to the audience. First off, we got Rick Vanover. I was going to call you Hanover. There's a moving company here local that's Hanover. Sorry about that, Rick. Rick Vanover. He's Senior Director of Product Strategy at Veeam. Rick, glad you're here today. Welcome.
Yeah, cheers, Nick. Happens all the time. I get Vancouver, I get Hanover, but I've even messed it up and said Rick Veemover. Okay, that's what happens.
That's
when
even better.
Been there
You're
for
devoted.
12 years.
Yeah, you're dedicated, man. I love that. Thank you. I appreciate it. Also joining me is Tom May, CEO of Different Dev, focused on the architecture of BCDR solutions. Tom, thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure to be here. I don't have a fancy name swap story to follow up, so I don't know, maybe a little lackluster.
I once called Cisco Crisco. I'm really embarrassed about it. I did that on a live webinar, so I'll take that one for you. I'll take the hit for the team. Also joining us from Offsite Data Sync is Jonah May. And if you've noticed the last name, I just found out before the call that Tom and Jonah are related. And so that's fancy. Didn't recognize that at all. It does happen. He's a Veeam Vanguard and focuses on implementing BCDR solutions and data protection solutions for their customers. So Jonah, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. And yeah, I guess you could say Tom and I go a little bit of a ways back.
Yeah, you do, just a little bit. Yeah, however old you are. You don't need to know. Today's format, for those in the audience, today's format's a little different. We're doing just a panel discussion here. I've got a bunch of kind of questions I've written down here in front of me as well. And we're going to try to break this up into kind of three parts. And the first area we're going to talk about, and if you look at the slides, are just kind of topic headings, what we're talking about more than anything. Feel free to actually put in a question in the Q&A box, like I said, to kind of keep the conversation going and to include you in on it. The first thing we're going to talk about today is the idea of, is ransomware actually a question of whether it's a when and not an if? Now, I've got a couple of industry stats that I've written down here, so I'm going to cheat for a moment here. The first two actually come from Veeam's own 2022 Data Protection Trends Report. And it's 76% of organizations have experienced a ransomware attack in the last 12 months. And 60% of orgs have actually experienced 2 or more attacks in that same time frame. So it's kind of a question of, unless lots and lots of organizations that are seeing this. Also from Comparatech, the average downtime for ransomware attacks has increased from 9 to nearly 10 days, just downtime. And the projected cost of downtime for 2021, based on the analysis, is over $27 billion in total. So there's a lot of cost here, a lot of concern just of whether or not ransomware is actually going to happen to your organization or not. We actually are glad that you're here today because you're at least thinking about it, trying to understand that. But let's talk about this. And Tom, I'm actually going to start with you. I've got a question here because I know your services focus a lot around proactively kind of architecting BCDR scenarios for customers and all kinds of different operational disturbances, as it were. It could be weather or power outage and so on. So from your perspective, how much of a concern is a ransomware in this mix for businesses today?
Oh, it's absolutely huge now. Even from the White House, we're being told to be prepared, if you will. And maybe 6 months ago, it wasn't taken as seriously, but the world's changed and people are really starting to take a hard look at ransomware. So top of their list, the most important contact we get daily is, can you help us? We know it's coming. And sadly, sometimes, hey, it's already been there. What do we do? So it's paramount.
And then Rick, how much is Veeam seeing from looking at customers, even prospects, just around the idea of needing to protect themselves against ransomware attacks or respond to ransomware attacks, I should say?
Well, there's two things that stick out to me, Nick. First of all, by the numbers you read out, I think it's important for the audience to know that a lot of times people prepare for disaster in the context of fire, flood, and blood and things like that. But by the numbers, ransomware is the disaster that is much more likely to be something that organizations are going to have to deal with. And so it should be conflated. And then to your question of how does it kind of impact our day-to-day here at Veeam? Well, for one, it comes up in every conversation. And I mean that in a good way, because it's very powerful what is on the truck right now with Veeam products and some of our service provider partners, like what Jonah and his expertise can do. And so the time is now to do something about this risk. And it comes, like I said, it comes up in every conversation, and there's more options than ever. So that's the light at the end of the tunnel. But the takeaway is the time to act is now from a preparation standpoint.
I completely agree. Jonah, are you seeing something similar from the offsite data sync perspective when you're talking to customers about implementing solutions, what their concerns are about, what they're trying to protect against?
I am. A lot of what Rick said is aligning with what I'm seeing both at offsite data sync and at previous cloud providers I've worked at. I mean, to give you an idea, in the past, we used to see disaster recovery requests, of course, to spin up data offsite. And in many cases, those were a lot of the more traditional spin up requests. A natural disaster like a hurricane strikes the Gulf of Mexico, there's a fire in a data center, or a water pipe burst. These days, almost every restore request we see in a year is ransomware or malicious attack related.
It's actually, you mentioned those other kinds of disasters, and even Tom, you mentioned a little bit as well. You think about even something, let's say like a lightning storm. That's something that could happen. It might actually exist in your geography, versus there are definitely cyber criminal gangs that make lots and lots of ransomware who are, hell-bent on trying to get as much money as they can out of organizations. And there's this huge, what I call kind of an automated opportunistic, I should say an automated opportunity, if you will, where literally it doesn't even have to be necessarily spearphishing or targeting a specific organization. It could literally be a spray of grabbing the billions of email addresses that came out of, let's say, a LinkedIn leak from years ago, and just seeing what you get. And so it seems to me, kind of, Jonah, back to your point of, you've got these other kinds of disasters where it could be a flood or a something, but it just feels like maybe that's part of why you and Rick, Tom, you guys have all said it's kind of the same thing, that's part of the reason why this is becoming kind of more of a, I don't want to say a guarantee. It's guaranteed you're going to get hacked or your money back. That's not going to happen. But it's one of those things where you just know it has a far higher likelihood. I mean, are you all three of you? You can nod or take turns, whatever. Is that what you're seeing?
Yeah, Nick. Let me put this another way. The threat actors have an infinite number of chances to get it right. Okay, to find that one person who will click that phish email, find that one edge site that does still have RDP on the internet, which we're not supposed to do anymore, or find that one vulnerability that hasn't been updated and patched type of thing, which, by the way, phish, remote access done wrong, and unpatched vulnerabilities are the top 3 modes of entry. So there's a piece of advice across the board. All the research indicates that. But the threat actors have an infinite number of attempts to get it right just once, whereas the good people, us and you on this call, we have to be right and on 100% of the time to deflect those kind of unlimited chances that they have to get in.
Yeah, I would completely agree here. So let me pose this to you. The question that this sort of aspect of the webcast today was focusing on is ransomware a matter of when and not if? And so I almost want to kind of pose it this way from each of your perspectives. And I'm going to kind of go through each one of you and ask you this same question here. Do you think that threat is something that that will definitely happen in the future to, let's say, I don't mean this in an exact literal sense, but every business that exists today, or at least obviously the potential is there, but do you think this is something that's really everybody's a question of when and not if? And maybe Tom, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. I think every sector in the world is a target today. I think the days of someone specifically looking at you like in a movie and going, I'm going to hack entity A, and I'm going to get in there and penetrate. Sure, that exists, but right now it's just like the magic tumblers are spinning and malware is just churning, and it could be going after grandma, it could be going after a Fortune 100. There's no discrimination there. It's just what magic tumbler falls into place. So absolutely, it's there.
It's a great point. One of the things that we've seen collectively, I think all of us have seen this in the industry, is looking at a ransomware and the cyber criminal gangs behind them as businesses. And then each one starts focusing on what they're good at. In the same way that, let's say, I don't know, the difference between a company that does, let's say, mowing lawns for people at their homes versus someone who decides, you know, I'm far better working for businesses and doing landscaping. They're in the same kind of business, but they focus on something slightly different. You mentioned grandmas as the example. It's someone who's good at that. There was an attack the other day that just started out. I read about this, where what they start with is their thing is they go to websites that have that customer service pop-up thing. Hey, how can I help you? And their whole thing is to say all the right words just to get them to send them the email, like the follow-up email, so they can then try and social engineer them into clicking a link. And the idea there being, well, that limits your scope of your audience. One, it's got to be probably a business and not an individual. So now we're factoring down. And then two, it's got to be somebody who has one of those pop-up forms or a customer service form, which, I mean, that's of course most every business, but that's the idea. That's their mode. And so it really does kind of feel like, to your point, that every industry is susceptible. Every person in a lot of ways is susceptible. I think it's just a question of, when does someone decide, you know what, I think we're going to go after that vertical or that size organization or that particular demographic or whatever that might be, and then that becomes their target. I mean, would you kind of agree, Tom?
Oh, absolutely. You do narrow your focus as you get more strategic. But I mean, we're seeing it all over. It's funny you said landscapers. We actually had a landscaping company come to us that was hit for about $2 million worth of ransom. So we joke about, you know, a landscaper, if you will. Some of those are pretty big businesses. And when they were targeted, it definitely wasn't a specific initial spearfish. It was just they were on the radar. Someone clicked the wrong link and, ooh, it was a great payday that day.
Yep. All right. So back to the original question, Rick, maybe I pose it to you. Every business is going to see a ransomware attack at some point. What's your thoughts there?
Yeah, definitely agree. And let me put some context around that. There are so many different types of threats out there. And I want to cite two different industry resources to help the audience navigate that. One is a website called virustotal.com, where you can upload a file and actually see if it has fingerprints of a known threat, DNA of a file, if there is such a thing. There's technologies to do that. And the other thing is, my favorite ransomware resource, hands down, and the only YouTube channel I subscribe to, is the PC security channel, where Leo will demo some of the ransomwares. Why I bring that up is he will demo some of the emerging ransomwares. Like, there's a new one out that goes after Discord and Slack and will embed itself in GIFs and things like that. The Discord one, I think the decryption is the cost to buy a coffee, like a $3, like just, you know, whatever, like a e-coffee gift card. Like, what are these like $5 million ransoms that I hear about? Where I'm going with that, Nick, to your point of these affiliate networks, the dark web, they're all sharing resources, best practices. That's a development league of ransomware. That's what's happening there. And so the grandmas and the private citizens who might easily just do that, it's cycles, it's QA is what that is, right? So all the way down the ransomware supply chain, if there is such a thing, you're seeing these types of things. But definitely keep in mind Virus Total and the PC Security channel on YouTube to be up to date on the latest for sure.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Rick. Jonah, kind of same question. Thoughts on it? Is every business, every being every, but is every business, should they expect that they're going to see a ransomware attack at some point?
Right. I mean, you can never say with absolute certainty that something will or won't happen, of course, but it is just better as a rule of thumb to, you know, Eagle Scout here, be prepared, you know, always expect that you're going to be penetrated. So you can always try and stay ahead of the curve with attack vectors. Like, keep your machines patched. Are you running regular phishing and engineering drills with your employees? Are you using some of Veeams built-in tools to monitor and remediate? Are you within best practices for your backup systems?
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's sort of like the same idea. I always think of cybersecurity going back to like the 1100s, the 1200s, the medieval Europe kind of thing. And you think about having a moat and the castle walls and archers and, you know, the big vats of tar pouring down. And you don't do that stuff, to your point, John. You don't do that after you've been attacked. You know what? We should probably build a wall. That'd be a good idea. You dig the moat beforehand. You build the walls beforehand because you make the assumption it's going to happen. And it's no longer a case of, we used to think about ransomware and having like backups as I remember literally, I mean, Rick, you remember this as well. Go back 10 years or so, and backups were like an insurance policy. Like, why am I really paying for this? I'm not going to really need this. and only big businesses who are really thinking about operational efficiency and staying open on always on. We're thinking about that, but now it's like a reality. And so there's that need. I need a moat. I need walls. I need to hire some archers. I got to sharpen the swords. I got to have all this stuff ready because an attack is probably very likely going to happen. I mean, that's kind of, I think, where you're going, Joan. Does that sound about right?
It does.
Yes. No, but you're not. You don't sound like you're very good with swords or archer or bows.
Yeah.
So,
a little bit with archery. Haven't really gotten much of a chance to use swords.
That's all right. No need there, hopefully. So let me just kind of put up here real quick. Our next sort of subtopic is this idea of what aspects of planning a ransomware recovery are most critical. And I've got a couple stats again. I'm going to start with one that comes from GetApp's 2021 Data Security Report. And they found that only 33% of organizations have 33% of organizations have no incident response plan. So the majority of you do, but there's a full third that have no response plan. And that's a general response plan, not just one specific to ransomware. It's overarching. So then if you go down to something specific for ransomware, that number is probably a bit higher, meaning there's a higher percentage of organizations that don't have a response plan specifically for ransomware. Because of the nature of it, you don't know which systems are going to be out. You really effectively, if you think about it, especially with the idea of gaining access, the initial access through, you heard Rick talk about RDP sessions to some kind of endpoint, maybe through vulnerabilities to a server that's exposed on the internet. They're getting an initial foothold. Usually there's a lot of lateral movement, which means they have access to credentials in your environment. A lot of times, in almost all cases, Active Directory becomes part of an attack, which means it's modified to some degree. You're going to have to recover everything. It's not just recovering like just the systems that were encrypted. That's not the answer. The answer is you have to put your environment back into what I call a known good, meaning it's operational, and a known secure state, back to where you knew it was secure before it was hacked. And so that's really necessary. A couple other stats back from the Veeam 2022 Data Protection Trends Report. At best, only 80% of the data is recoverable in most cases, and only 19% of organizations were able to accomplish that. And then the average organization is only able to recover about 64% of their data. That speaks to usually a lack of preparation, more so than they didn't have, the solution couldn't recover it. Of course, the solution can. If you have everything backed up, you can get it. So it's really about planning for that. And so, Tom, I'll start with you again, if that's okay. When you're helping your customers plan for ransomware recovery, so you're architecting a solution, you're thinking about the recovery of a ransomware attack and so on, what are some of those core elements to that plan that should be included?
Well, a lot of people would quote, know your objectives, your RTOs, your RPOs, how are you going to do something? But really, we're going to scale it back to the most boring concept you could imagine. It's almost as if we're the accountants of the computing world. We really have to go to square one and understand how our systems operate, right? It's not just bringing up a VM. It's not just making sure there's connectivity, but understanding who are my key players in those business systems? Where are the stakeholders? How are they interoperating? So there's a lot of pre-documentation that has to be done. So once we understand how the enterprise works, now we can start discovering how will we recover it. But you'd be surprised between all the regime changes at different IT companies and whatnot. I mean, everywhere from the C-suite down sometimes flips 2, 3, 4 times. And when we see this matrix of an attack, it's usually not even the current regime that set up that vulnerability. Maybe that RDP session, like Rick had said, was set up by 3 people ago. Who knows what's going on? So we go back to that unsexy world of documentation. As engineers, they really want to just build it better. The fact is, we have to document it to be able to mitigate it. So I would say start with your homework, understand your networks, every facet, every speaker, and then bring together the full harmony of your system to understand. I mean, even the CFO's office is so critical. Are we concerned with downtime of a billing system? Maybe not. Customers can be billed in 3 days. That doesn't affect our revenue. What does? Our service modules. If we can't get out there and actually make a billable hour, that's a higher priority on a recovery. So it really is a lot of paperwork to bring it around.
I love that you're starting with the business, because typically whenever we're talking about coming up with a recovery strategy for any business disruption, it normally starts with a business impact analysis, which is define the workloads. What would it look like if it was down? How long can you be without? Use your example of the billing system. We're fine for 3 days, or whatever the answer is. And then after that, it's doing a risk analysis of which disruptions, and I'm using a very broad terms that we were covering, acts of God and power outages and ransomware attacks and everything in between. You look at what's the likelihood that we think as an organization those are going to happen, and then you sort of cross-reference the two analyses to go, all right, so if in a ransomware attack that particular system gets impacted, then you can start figuring out what your recovery strategy needs to look like. So I love that you start with the business, because I'm always a big believer in start with the business first and its objectives and work your way towards technology. And so often as IT professionals, I mean, I've been in this for 28 years. I owned an MSP before. I've owned an enterprise consulting company where I design networks for every big name company you can think of. And one of the things I've always found with IT folks is we tend to start with the tech and work backwards, like, cool, it can back up this and that, or it comes in these 7 colors and those 4 languages. Okay, what can I do with that? As opposed to saying, what does the business need? And do I have the right technology? And where's the gap? And what do I need to fill in that gap? So, I mean, I'm adding more to what you said, but I know it was all in there. So well said. I love your answer. Jonah, if I can go to you next, you're the one who's sort of implementing these kinds of plans. So you have a customer that's got an architected solution of some kind or design that they want to get implemented. You're putting that in place. My question for you is, which parts of the recovery plan are customers sort of generally missing the mark on? Maybe they're overlooking it. Maybe they're not doing everything they should be doing. But what part of the overarching recovery plan do you think they really missed the mark?
I'm going to bring up 2 points here. One's on-prem and then one's off-premises, and kind of builds off Tom's discussion of documentation a little bit. The first, on-prem, is especially in cases with Veeam, we see a lot of cases where customers go through the effort to, get their backup jobs set up, maybe do some replication or CDP, but they fail to properly harden the Veeam infrastructure against the penetration. So, some examples of that I've seen, they keep some or all of their Veeam components and backup repositories on the Active Directory domain, and the domain gets compromised. So everything gets encrypted and is unusable, or their Veeam server, and in some cases also their backup repositories, are virtual machines on their data stores. And increasingly we're seeing where ransomware is not necessarily encrypting just Windows machines anymore, but even going into ESX and vCenter at the host level and encrypting the data stores, meaning all of your on-prem is unusable and you have to go offsite. And then the big one we see offsite is failback procedure. How do we restore our recovered, spun up workloads that are offsite back to our production environment once we're fully scrubbed and ready to go? In some products, replication and CDP, it's a little bit easier. There's some built-in functionality there. But here at ODS, we also let our customers recover from Cloud Connect backup, which takes a few more steps. And when we're performing one of our DR tests with the customer, we spend a lot of time talking about how they should test, what they should test, what does a process for an actual failure look like, and getting all that spun up and handed off back to your company. But a lot of what the customers fail to touch on with us is, well, how do we get that data back?
That's all good points there. It's interesting. Back to your first point about on-premises. I've looked at some detail of some specific cyber attacks, ransomware attacks, where they literally looking for 40 different types of file types that are all the different backup file types. Seen others that are literally trying to go and find vulnerabilities of NAS and SAN devices so that they could try to hack those boxes in order to get access to, what might be considered not it's not cloud storage, but it's not on the server that's doing the backups themselves, but gaining access to the storage devices within the environment. I mean, things like that, where the threat actors are really trying to figure out, how do I get to that? How do I get to the data, delete it all, so that you have to pay the ransom, which is the goal. And I love that you brought cloud-based backups up, because that becomes the old 3-2-1 backup rule. The one is always in, one copy is off-site. That's the cloud. I mean, at a minimum, that's the cloud. It could be, yes, it could be stored in some Tape Mountain type company or whatever, if you want to really like tape somewhere. But the cloud makes sense there. Rick, let me kind of throw this question over to you a little bit. You've got a different vantage point, because you're thinking about I know you have backup software with a lot of capabilities, and I'm going to guess that customers use some or all of the capabilities, and you're always thinking, the people that use some, if they only use this other thing. So you have a very different vantage point when you're thinking about recovery, because you're seeing all the possible ways that one can perform recovery and get a consistent and and desired outcome here. So from that vantage point, what do you see as being critical about planning so that someone can have a successful recovery from a ransomware attack?
Sure, Nick. Well, there's two things. First is we can't recover what hasn't been backed up. Kind of like we can't assess the impact if we don't have the documentation. Same thing, next step. And the other side of that is, Jonah's observations of people having implementations where ransomware goes end to end through infrastructure, that's real. I'm seeing it too. And my advice to the market is you don't necessarily have to rework everything. And that's the part where sometimes people get all wrapped around the axle. It's like, oh, I got to redo this and make 38 more usernames and passwords that are on an island or something like that. Maybe. But for a lot of people, especially those using Veeam, they don't understand how easy it is to really up your recoverability. Example, if I'm a organization that is quote unquote thrown Veeam in and I'm using one password for everything, not a good idea. You could very easily set up what we call a copy job to a Cloud Connect service provider with insider protection, which Jonah can help you with that. And the reality is those backups meet my criteria of being ultra resilient, which is where I put anything that's either offline, air gapped, or immutable. And the reality is those insider protection backups, those are super powerful because those require 4 eyes recovery. Like if I'm an organization and I put my backups in there, I can't get them without Jonah or his team's help, right? So if even if I know where the bodies are buried, I know where the data is going, the insider protection element gives me an incredible way. So my advice is the preparation is real, but the rework, you don't necessarily have to rework everything. It can start as simple as a copy job to a service provider, because we might need an offsite copy anyways. We might not even have that. Back to the 3-2-1 rule. So the rework is less than a lot of people think. And then the other side of it is, back to my earlier comment of this is the disaster most likely to fall upon an organization nowadays. Backwards, assess the impact, just like was shared, right? What do we need to do? And keep in mind, here's the trick. You might not always be able to restore to where you came from. And I've heard of scenarios of the digital equivalent of, yellow police tape around your data center, and root cause analysis from, incident response teams or cybersecurity teams taking weeks. You might need to restore somewhere else. I don't know if that matches what you're seeing, Jonah, but it's like, these are just some things that go into this. And at a minimum, get a backup off site to a place that can also help you if you need to go somewhere else, type of thing. You have your data, but you can't go back here, type of thing.
From the pre-sale side, that's a lot of conversations we're having lately, especially as Veeam continues to support more and more of the writing backups to the public cloud. It's, well, why do I want to write to a cloud service provider as opposed to, sending a backup copy mirrored to S3 or Azure or GCP? And that's the exact conversation. If it goes over there, can you guarantee that you can restore it back immediately to your data center? And what do you do in the meantime while you're handling the incident response?
Exactly.
Yeah, there's putting some data around this for a second. I mentioned early on the average downtime is now considered, the average is 10 days. It was just downtime. But to your point, Rick, about the yellow tape around the data center, the average with this is a company called Cover that does like the response to ransomware in terms of like negotiating with the ransomware folks and whatnot. The average case duration they have is 20 days. So to your point, we think back to, if you guys remember the city of Baltimore, it was that 2020, I think it was, when they got hit. It was months before they were operational, and part of it was because they didn't know what they could turn back on that wasn't impacted. Maybe still have malware on it. And so, Rick, I think it's a great point, and Jonah, you adding to that the idea of you may have to just recover somewhere else, and then while you're operating in that effectively somewhere else, you figure out how to get the old infrastructure back to, again, a known good, known secure state. Jonah, does that line up with what you're seeing?
It does. I mean, like I even touched on earlier, a lot of people don't consider that failback procedure.
Yeah.
And I've even heard rumors of ransomware that's even going in and encrypting on your hardware switches now too. So you get everything clean, you get your ESX backup, you start to recover back, and what happens? Your networking equipment re-encrypts everything.
I've seen NAS devices bricked to factory defaults. tape
Wow.
devices taken over. So best practice, don't leave your default passwords on switching, including Wi-Fi. Don't leave your default passwords on tape libraries. Don't leave your default passwords on any of the infrastructure components, because those are a target too. And then if you are doing tapes, make sure you get them out of the library, because then before they'll wipe it, they'll erase every tape in the library, type of thing.
So let's go on to the last part of our conversation. If I can just put this last slide up for everybody here. And this is sort of looking at what kinds of help can you expect from your software partners, your solution partners, that sort of thing. Most organizations aren't focused on backups all the time. You have someone whose job it is to worry about backup and recovery, and you may even have a recovery plan, even have a recovery team or an incident response team, those kinds of things. But there's often a lack of, I'll say this nicely, this is not putting any of you in the audience down at all, so please don't take it that way, but a lack of experience and a lack of expertise that someone who does that all the time, every day, all day long has. They've seen many more scenarios. I mean, Rick, just the things that you mentioned about, tape drives and Wi-Fi and switches, that's something that maybe all of you in the audience might go, I've never had that experience. Right. That's the reason why you might want to go outside and go, I think if we're going to do this right, we might want to get some help. And so the question kind of becomes, like you can see up here, what kinds of help can you expect? What's the benefit going to be to you? And this, by the way, this is not a pitch. By any means, this section is not a pitch, so please don't think it is. This is just continuing the conversation. If you're going to go and realize I only have so much ability internally in the organization, or we have only so much ability in the organization, what can we expect to get from outside help, and how much better will it prepare us for ransomware attacks, or for responding to ransomware attacks? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to start with Tom. When you're looking at customers, I'm wondering where are the biggest gaps in most of their organizations that require architecting some kind of recovery plan, and how a partner can help.
It's a beautiful marriage that we have here between a Veeam accredited service partner and a Veeam cloud service provider, and the fact that there are so many moving parts here. Often, the whole reason backups come in play, I'm hearing more and more, is the cyber carrier. Their insurance policy carrier requires that something be in place. And 3 years ago, you could throw around the word Veeam and it was acceptable. What do you do for a backup? Veeam, move on. It has to be a little bit more granular now. So when you talk about bringing in a VASP, and when we roll up our sleeves and jump in, it's really understanding the end goal here. Many of the things that Jonah and Rick have talked about usually is the afterthought. It's, well, do I really need to get it offsite? Yes, I know, but let me think about getting it on-prem. Well, it's crucial then to engage with a partner that has that understanding of the end goal, so we architect things properly and avoid the rework. It's bad enough when you have to retool your organization. It's quite chaotic when you have to do it 2 or 3 times, because just the premise of you don't know what you don't know until you're there. And that's the expertise that a partner brings to you. Even just a simple Veeam installation, making sure it's off of the domain, making sure that it is in a domain that's separate so you can leverage things such as Sure Backup. It's so crucial, so we can really help architect a great solution that says, listen, we have great protection locally. We're testing it regularly. We're documented. We've found our gaps, but now we're moving it off site. When we move it to a great VCSP like offsite data sync, are they immutable? Do they have insider protection? What can they do? But also, are they there on the phone when we need them, so they can go ahead and move locations if we have to? We've expanded our team wider, again, by engaging a VCSP like offsite data sync. So it's a really good harmony working with qualified people, because as you said, those people that are running backups for their organizations, they're only spending about 5% of their time over there. And it is so absolutely crucial. Not that they're not wanting more, there's so many other day-to-day things. So you can engage the right partners to bring a better solution forward. And it just works in harmony. It's the same reason why we don't develop backup software. We lean on Veeam's expertise to write the Cadillac of packages, and then we just leverage it to bring solutions.
Tom, I'm just going to keep a question with you for a second. I also see a benefit of leveraging a partner to architect the solution from the standpoint of maybe expanding the scope. I do find that organizations sometimes have I'll use, just for the purposes of the conversation, a rudimentary recovery plan where we're going to recover that, as opposed to maybe leaning on your experience saying, I'm not trying to put a bunch of FUD in here, but they literally can wipe out your entire operation. You really should be thinking about recovering everything offsite. Oh, we weren't, the scope wasn't there in the same way. The thinking about what recovery means is different. Do you find that to be the case where you're thinking about, I'm thinking about all of, I can't do it, all of this, when they're thinking about this, I want to go with my arms way out here and you can't see all that, but you get my point?
Oh, absolutely. All day long. The initial scope is we just need it protected. Tell me about this ransomware. Some C-level saw something on CNBC and they're like, oh gosh, ransomware is a thing. We just need to be protected. And they really don't think about it. Like we'll often hear, well, let's go to S3, which is great. There's so much power over there. But on your darkest, worst day, when you're in the trenches trying to recover it, who are you calling when you have that? You really need to leverage some of those partners so you can call an offsite data sync and you can say, help, and they're there because they've done it time and time again. And that's really, I always think of it like insurance sales. And it's horrible because I had a friend that did it when I was young and he tried to get me involved. And he'd always joke and say, part of our job is to spill the blood on the floor. We walk in and we go, you need to buy this because everything bad that could ever happen will happen to you and everyone you love. And you're like, oh gosh. And a lot of organizations, when we get in there, we start sounding like that. You need to do all this spend and translate. And they're just like, whoa, guy, we don't have money for that. And it's helping educate them that, listen, this one little thing, just this one little thing could just bring it all down. Because I think it was Rick, I believe, said it, or maybe it was you, Nick, where, the good guys have one time to get it right. These guys have multiple times. They're just cracking the safe with the tumblers till it all falls into line. And one little oversight can just cause so much damage and give you that 21 days of downtime.
That bit of wisdom came from Rick Vanover, so I'll give him credit. He's smiling. Jonah, what parts of implementing and maybe even some ongoing management of a recovery implementation do you think we can partners help with to make sure that the outcome is predictable?
I'd say a big one is the DR testing. Especially in small businesses, it's something that's extremely overlooked. And what I like to tell people when I'm on our DR calls at ODS and even in some recent events I've attended for VMware user groups is you kind of have 3 tiers to DR testing. Tier 1 being workload restoration. If I recover from a backup, does the machine boot? Tier 2 being application consistency. If it's a domain controller, is Active Directory accessible? Is it accessible? Is my SQL Server database coming back up? And tier 3 being kind of the networking and stress testing. Does everything communicate with itself properly? How long does it take for those machines to boot? Do they compare similar to production functionality? And there's some very good tools that Veeam has, Sure Backup, Sure Replica, Disaster Recovery Orchestrator, that work great for the on-prem, but they take a little bit to set up and do just right to get all that information. And unfortunately, especially when you're talking Cloud Connect backup, there's not necessarily Veeam tools for all of that today, but a lot of service providers such as ODS have developed tools and processes to help customers with that. And my mantra with customers is if you haven't tested your backups, they're worthless because you don't know if they're going to work. But beyond even just knowing everything works, that's how you update your run books. That's how you find anything that might go wrong in reality. Another thing we tell customers is we want things to fail during your DR test because we want to find those during the test and not during the actual failure. You might find that there's a firewall rule that you need put into the DR environment to enable a third-party application to communicate with its licensing server.
Yeah, we have one of our audience members actually just commented while you were talking, Aiden, and Aiden said, a backup isn't a backup until you've recovered from it. It's sort of profound. It's just like the best laid plans are only worth the paper they're on unless you've actually put them into action and that sort of thing. So well spoken. Rick, last questions for you. And then we're still happy to take some questions from those in the audience. None have come in that I can see, but happy to make sure we answer some questions there for you. I'm again assuming that the audience is probably thinking, what we would think of, because we know the possibilities collectively here of what you can do with recovery. they're probably thinking of more of a basic, a lesser form, a more rudimentary. I mean, again, not trying to be, putting the audience down. That's not the point. Just more, it's less complex. Let's put it that way, of a recovery of their data applications and systems. So going beyond just the simplest kind of, I made a backup set and I can recover it. Looking beyond that, where else can a software vendor that makes backup software, where else can they help augment the recovery of all the affected parts of an environment?
Let me take you on a journey to bring you up from the way back when to now. And Aiden, I've got one more one-liner for you. I like to say, back up for show, recover for dough. I'll be here all week.
Oh, that's nice. Thank you.
Yeah, I used that at a golf event. It was good there. Anyways, but Nick, when I grew up in IT, back when I, squirty little kid with hair and everything, I used to go and do these annual DR tests. The company would give me free pizza. We'd test a bunch of things. Half of it would work. The other half was out of date. Let's say we'd fix it next year. That just isn't going to fly anymore today, right? Where we are today and the resources that both Tom and Jonah highlighted are at the ready. But then when I look at Veeam's role, I think actually everybody should know that Veeam has a dedicated tech support group. We call it SWAT, somewhat above a tier. It's somewhere between tier 2 and tier 3. It's higher than tier 1. 1 is the entry level and it goes up from there instead of down and back. But anyways, they give me all the good info. That's where I get my insights. These are a band of professionals that deal with it every day. And there's incredible value in that. And I'm going to share 2 tricks that they do, right? That sometimes you might not have thought of. Well, 2 tricks in a story. One time I'll debrief. This was a healthcare scenario. This was on the news. Ransomware locked them out. And they're like, just like Jonah said, they want to count for everything. Backups were toast. Primary infrastructure was toast. What are you going to do? And they're like sitting there scratching their head. And our support team said, are you using the storage integration? And the customer said, what's that? And it was one of those things that the storage team and the backup team wasn't talking to each other, and the server team, et cetera. Turns out they had a storage array that had a Veeam integration that every 4 hours took a storage snap. Oh, they stood up a new Veeam server, logged into that storage, and just started popcorning out instant recoveries from storage snapshots. They didn't even know they had that. That's luck. We don't want that as part of it. And so from Ken's bit, what can you do to prepare, right? At a minimum, take that advice of having a copy go somewhere off the domain. You could set up a VHR, a Veeam hardened repository, Ken, on Linux, lickety quick, and you could do a backup copy to that, or send it off site to something like a service provider, Jonah's, for example, with cloud connected insider protection. That one would be off site and with 4 eyes recovery, more resilient than just a VHR on premises. And then the other 2 pieces of advice I'll give you are sometimes, you have to mix it up a little bit. I learned a long time ago, one of my mentors early on told me some of the toughest technology problems can be solved, not by, throwing everything away and starting over, but by altering the geometry. And what I mean by that is, you have a backup. Well, what if I just need the files? I might not trust what else has been done, right? Let me set up a new target and restore just the files and the data there. That might be an easier ask, reprovisioning access, than trusting where I came from. Or one trick our support team started telling me about was for image-based recovery, restore the OS volume older and then the data volume's newer, and just kind of put Humpty Dumpty back together that way. You can have some tricks around these types of things, right? And then you got to call these people to look at what's going on and get that expert help. And then, to Ken's bit, setting up a backup copy job to Linux is so easy. And I want to have it done as soon as I can, but I've got a workshop that walks you through how to do that. Not everybody can rock down in Linux with the best of them. I can't, but I am walking you through how to do this. And I also think it's important, Nick, my last bit here is to realize that not all backups are created equal. To Aiden's point, to my, little kind of cheeky comment of backup for show, restore for dough. One of the things that Veeam's taken very, very seriously, and this is completely defendable. Not all backup vendors think this way. Veeam backups are completely self-describing and portable. And I would go so far to say that they're absolutely portable. So let me give you just a raw example. I could put an image-based backup today under management with Jonah and his peers in Cloud Connect with insider protection, fire, flood, and blood, ransomware, complete loss of every site that I've ever had before. Everything is gone. All I have is this data on his disk, and I have an encryption password. I can completely drive absolute recovery from that. You know, that's it. There's no catalog. There's no dependencies on these types of things, right? So, you know, having this absolute portability, same thing to the cloud. I could have backup data in an S3 bucket, and that's it. I can drive complete recovery with Veeam, or even crazier. And then you can throw the free edition, the Veeam Community Edition, start popping out restores too. We take that real seriously. And same thing with our Kubernetes products, same thing with our cloud native backup products. You know, that this is a mindset in the backup industry that's defendably unique. It's built into our business model and the technology. But I think having that help from Veeam support to the services that Tom and Jonah mentioned, you can't do this on your own as well as you can with help. And that is straight from my professional experience. What I see, everything, I'll take the top 5 things I see of breakdowns in ransomware. We've hit all of them, you know, things from updates, remote access, and phish awareness, but then the multiple copies, having not one account used for everything, managing your passwords, having a plan. I've seen scenarios where people take a day to figure out what the heck to do. You know, that's just not right. So public sector, like cities and states, do a little bit better there, but sometimes in the middle part of the private sector, not so good. Area for improvement. And the last thing is just knowing what you have. You know, that's the other problem. I don't even know what I have. How can I even drive recovery? So we hit on a lot of good things, but the good news is that the technologies are there to do everything we need to drive high confidence in data recovery. And then the threatscape's going to change, right? If we were having this conversation in 6 months, I'm going to have new little nuggets of info, right? Because we're not going to ever be done with this. And I think it's something that we just have to outsmart these threat actors continually.
All good stuff, Rick. I mean, it really is. So I think we're going to kind of sum things up here. We've got a couple minutes left, about 14 minutes left, but no questions have come in. So I'm going to just put up this last slide here. If I was going to stop the video, that's not the button I want to press. I want to press this button over here just to kind of put this up here. And I'm going to leave this up as we're kind of doing our last bit of discussion here. And in lieu of having questions from the audience, and if anybody's typing one in, go right ahead. I have both boxes open, happy to answer questions if we can. But in lieu of that, for the moment, Tom and Jonah and Rick, if I could put you guys each on the spot and just maybe some final thoughts, you know, sum up your own position. I've obviously sort of pigeonholed you as, you know, experts in very specific parts of this whole thing, but, you know, feel free to go any direction you want. But Tom, can I start with you?
Oh, absolutely. You know, speaking to the technology that exists, the most overlooked functions that we see on Veeam implementations would be Sure Backup and DRO, you know, that automated testing and logic to validate what's there. We don't have to dedicate human resources to do our testing. The tools are there and we should be using them regularly. And I'd say it's a very low adoption rate, and it's not hard to get there with the right partner, where you could be at a point to say, hey, we have this tested, it's done weekly, it's secure, and look, here it is. And it even gives you the documentation back on it. So such powerful tools. DRO, Sure Backup. If you don't know about it, get to know about it.
Jonah?
I'd say equally so on the cloud side. And I'll clarify because I saw someone ask what products we work with as offsite data sync. Offsite data sync is specifically Veeam. We do have some other brands in our portfolio that use some other products, such as, let's see, there's some Authe, there's Jungle Disk, there's a few others, but the biggest overlooked thing we see as a cloud provider that offers testing for both Cloud Connect backup and replication is testing. Everyone turns on their services with us, but they never come back to test their backups. Same thing as on-prem. It is a little more work because you can't get some of the automated testing like Sure Backup, but we're your last line of defense. You should want to make sure that everything works that's in our data center.
Rick, can I put a question over to you? I think this will be best answered this way. And I hope I say this person's name right, Monir. is asking about wanting to understand more about backup testing. Can you talk about, I mean, we know the idea of like doing a recovery and then booting up a system to make sure that it's, it's able to boot up and log in and so on. But can you talk about what all is possible from a backup testing perspective?
Yeah,
just
sure.
from the software perspective.
I'm going to converse from the heart, really, because Monir, this is something that made me join Veeam. I've been with Veeam 12 years. In November, it'll be 12 years. And I've spent that entire time on the product team. Before that, I used to work at a bank. And in 2010, Veeam released their version 5 product that in a absolutely undeniable way changed the backup industry. Dare I say it made it cool again. And the technology that they had in that version 5 was collectively, we call it, I don't know, we may still call it vPower, but it was basically just flipping backup on its head. Everything from instant recovery, which of virtual machines, which was unheard of at the time, to the backup testing. We call it Sure Backup, and now we got a fancier name with the data lab because there's incredible analytics use cases. So Monir, real quickly, what that is we're basically reversing the process. We're putting that backup data to use. And then that changes everything. So for one, you can take a backup and then in an automated way, ensure it's indeed recoverable. And what I mean by that is it's not just saying, oh yeah, everything copied okay. No. I'm going to make sure it turns on. I'm going to make sure heartbeats come in. I'm going to make sure networking doesn't throw up. I'm going to make sure applications I want are starting in the manner I'm looking for. This is very powerful. It's a game changer. I'll also put my other hat on and say, without a doubt, this is the most complicated part of Veeam. No, it is. Veeam's very easy to use. Go look on LinkedIn. There's no job title called Veeam administrator, right? It's easy. But this particular part of the product is the hardest part to use. And, an IT pro, if they allocated, 4 hours or even a whole day to understand the data lab, that time investment will pay dividends the rest of your IT career when it comes to backups. So the thought is testing the backups will actually ensure that it's recoverable, but it also exposes a great analytics environment. I'll give you one quick story, Nick. The thought is a couple years ago, there was an insurance organization, loved Sure Backup, and they had this really, I think this is a word, fiddlesome application in their environment, very delicate. Anytime you touch it, 3 other things would break. Maybe some of you have that. But anyways, there was this one fiddlesome application, and the security team said, hey, XYZ app is vulnerable to ABC vulnerability. We need to fix it. And the teams are freaking out because it's so fiddlesome. And then, in the back of the change control meeting, a backup person raises his hand and says, I got an idea. And they said, what are you talking about, backup person? It's like, well, I can spin the fiddlesome application up in the data lab and we can test the change there. And they're like, oh, really? So they did. They found the change and they were able to answer a number of quick questions. How long does it take to make this change? What do we need to do to implement that change? And therefore, when they go into production, they had complete confidence of success because they were able to test it in the data lab. So Monir and the others out there, unleash the potential of the data you have. It can really do a thing. There you go. So that's the short answer there, Nick. But hopefully it resonates well to the team.
I think so. I'll just add to that the idea of while you're building a recovery plan, there should be a testing portion of the plan. And then Munir says, I need a long answer. you got one. Otherwise, we'll be here all day. And in that testing portion of the recovery plan, in addition to the things that Rick is talking about, is even also doing like simulations of recovery and doing that kind of testing. You're testing the recovery itself. So not just testing the backups, making sure they're good and they're recoverable, but making sure that your recovery plan itself is actually good. And there's tabletop testing, which is just walking through it logically and talking about it and that kind of thing. And there's also partial and full simulation testing where you're literally doing kind of what Rick was talking about in the virtual environment, but doing it for all of your environment or all the parts that you want to recover and make sure that they work. Because you might actually find, for example, if you have to recover part of your environment, whether it's related to ransomware or not, that when you do have to recover it, let's say up in the cloud in a virtual environment, there are specific things you're going to have to do to make that your cloud environment talk to your on-prem environment that's still untouched. Those kinds of things all have to be thought through. So testing really does kind of come into play here. Jonah, any final thoughts before we close things out?
Any final thoughts? I know I saw something earlier. Somebody was asking about ODS's cloud portal specifically and seeing ransomware protection disabled. I'll just throw in for them that there's a good chance that means when whoever signed up your organization signed you up for our services, they didn't get that insider protection as part of the package. So talk to your account manager about getting it turned on.
Okay, cool. I didn't see that one, so I'm glad to see that there. So one question did come in from Aiden. Aiden says a standard 3-2-1 strategy in conjunction with testing of backups is a satisfactory scenario for a lot of small businesses. But are you seeing different iterations of this rule, meaning of the 3-2-1 backup rule? And he gives examples of like a 3-3-3 rule or a 6-4-2 rule with larger businesses.
I'll say Veeams. Yeah, Veeams specifically, I've seen more and more. It's not just 3-2-1 anymore. It's 3-2-1-1-0. Which, Rick, correct me if I get any of this wrong, but beyond traditional, the 3-2-1, that extra 1 and 0 are of your backups. One of those should be immutable, air gapped, etc. So that ransomware protection or an F3 object lock, and you should be able to test with 0 errors in your backups or your testing.
Got it. And for anybody joining us from Brunel, Florida, that's your zip code. Central Florida, represent.
That's fantastic. I think we've actually got all of the questions answered. I didn't see that one. I'm glad you jumped in there with that one, Jonah. So I'm going to go ahead and close things out. Rick, Tom, Jonah, thank you all very much for all of your insight today. Really appreciate you just kind of pouring out your thoughts to the audience. Obviously, we got some questions here and there. Rick, I saw that you were actually augmenting some stuff. I'd mentioned Codeware. You put a couple links. Really appreciate that as well. So thanks to all you guys for presenting today. And for those in the audience, hope you got something out of today. We had quite a number of you here. We were talking about how many people are going to show up, and you got about the number I thought we were going to get, which is right on the money. And we're really happy that you attended. It really means that you're serious about this problem. And that makes all of us happy, because that's kind of what gets us jazzed every day, is to think about how to thwart the bad guy. And there's lots of ways to do it. And as long as you put it into place. So we're glad you're here. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the comments as well. So this concludes today's webcast, again, brought to you by Offsite Data Sync, Veeam, and Different Dev. So this concludes today's webcast again, and we'll catch you guys on the next one. Thanks a lot.